The United States has more incarcerants than any other country in the world. To be specific, according to the Bureau of Justice, in 2013, the United States incarcerated 2,220,300 adults. That is a rather large number, and like I said, it is bigger than any other country in the world, including China, who is far less democratic and has triple our population. To put it in perspective, the ACLU has pointed out that despite having less than 5% of the world's population, then the United States has almost 25% of the world's prison population. Now, this fairly ridiculous problem is known as mass incarceration, and over the past few decades, it has grown out of control. From 1978 to 2014, our prison population has increased by 408%. It has increased eightfold. Now, there have been many problems associated with this. For one, it has led to serious overcrowding, leading to an unstable prison system. It has also torn apart families, sometimes needlessly. It has been implemented in discriminatory fashions, and it has been very, very expensive. So, of course, we need to solve this problem, and that is why here today I am going to introduce to you the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2015, a bipartisan bill currently attempting to make its way through Congress. And so, I will do two things today. I will explain to you why mass incarceration is a huge problem that we need to solve, and I will demonstrate how the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2015 could prove a crucial step in solving this problem. Now let me clarify something about mass incarceration, because many of you probably have the image of a bunch of criminals in prison who absolutely deserve their sentence, and therefore we should not feel sorry that they are all being incarcerated. But I would like to bring something to your attention. In the federal prison system, only 7.3% of inmates are in prison for violent offenses. The rest are in there for non-violent offenses. In fact, according to the same study, which once again comes to the Bureau of Justice, over 50% of our incarcerants are in prison for drug-related crimes, non-violent drug-related crimes. In other words, the influx of those who are in prison because of drug-related crimes has led to this overcrowding. Now, how did this happen? Well, in the 80s and 90s, we decided to get tough on crime, and in particular, we decided to institute a war on drugs. And one of our main weapons in this war on drugs was the imposition of harsh mandatory minimums for violations of drug laws. Now, for those of you who don't know what mandatory minimums are, basically they are laws that stipulate that if you are convicted for a certain crime, you must spend at least X amount of years in prison for your sentence. And when it came to drug laws in the 80s, we imposed some very high X's. Let me elaborate. For your first drug-related offense, you face a mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison. For your second drug offense, you face a mandatory minimum of 20 years. And for your third, life in prison. Furthermore, if you combine this with, say, a gun-related charge, then you can be completely out of society for as many as 50 years based on just your first offense, because the mandatory minimums can pile on. Now, the main reason this is a problem is because judges do not have discretion. They cannot account for extenuating circumstances and go below the mandatory minimum. And that is why, as a result of people committing nonviolent offenses, they are being put in prison for tremendous amounts of time, and that is where we get our mass incarceration problem. But let me explain why it is a problem. First of all, it is incredibly expensive. According to the Hamilton Project in 2014, we spent $80 billion on prisons, and this is up from $17 billion from 1980. Now imagine what we could do with that other $63 billion that we are wasting on this mass incarceration. Furthermore, mass incarceration is ripping apart families, and this can be to devastating effect. In 2009, the Sentencing Project published a study stating that 10 million children in the United States have experienced parental incarceration. And this can very much hurt them, even though it's not at all their fault. In 2007, the Annie Casey Foundation published a study citing the fact that children with mothers in prison have a 50% chance of being suspended from school, and they have a 10% chance of being outright expelled. In other words, as a result of incarceration of parents, children are less likely to get a good education, making them more likely to end up impoverished, potentially making them more likely to also end up being a criminal and getting swept up in the wave of mass incarceration as well. Furthermore, mass incarceration is a serious problem because it has been implemented in discriminatory fashions. As the ACLU has pointed out, despite the fact that blacks and whites use marijuana at roughly the same rate, African Americans are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. Furthermore, according to the Bureau of Justice, once more, over 60% of our incarcerants are either African American or Hispanic. The reason for this is that often minority neighborhoods are more strictly patrolled. Now, there's no need to go into reasons right now. The point I'm trying to make is that as a result of these harsh mandatory minimums, those who might be racist or those who might be inclined to be discriminatory against minorities are given more tools to work with, thus further hurting minorities. Finally, I would like to point out that mass incarceration has done a tremendous Mass incarceration has caused a great degree of overcrowding, and this has led to an instability in many of our prison systems. For example, in Arizona in 2013, the Arizona prison system was getting overcrowded and they needed to cut costs, so they privatized prison health care. And they did save $30 million, but 50 people also died. And for perspective, that was up from 37 people dying the previous 2 years. That is just one example of how mass incarceration has led to a more destabilized and out-of-control prison system. Now, we definitely must solve this problem, and that's what brings me to the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2015. Now, before I go into it, I would like to mention one more thing. Some of you may not be sympathetic to those who are in prison, and you may still not see the reason to fix it. But I would ask two things. One, put yourself in their shoes. As I have established, many of them are in prison for non-violent offenses. And furthermore, if you cannot put yourself in their shoes, be pragmatic. It's expensive, and it's growing more and more unstable. So, the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act of 2015, it does three major things to help fix the problem of mass incarceration. First and foremost, it takes steps to reduce mandatory minimums. For example, for a second drug offense, the mandatory minimum decreases from 20 years to 15 years. It may sound like baby steps, but it's certainly a step. Secondly, it retroactively applies these mandatory minimum reductions to those who are already in prison and have shown good behavior and are willing to complete a recidivism reduction program. Third, and perhaps most important, it is implementing safety valve provisions that will allow judges to use their discretion and go below mandatory minimum sentences if the defendant is nonviolent, if this was their first offense, if they did not sell drugs to children, and if they are willing to do a recidivism reduction program as well. So, in conclusion, we have a tremendous problem. We are trying to incarcerate people. That is sort of what we are doing. We are incarcerating people thinking that that will fix the problem on its own. But simply put, it is not. According to the Brennan Center for Justice in 2015, time in prison does not correlate to a reduction in recidivism. What can fix this is recidivism reduction programs. And that is what we will do with the savings with the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. Because Families Against Mandatory Minimums in 2015 estimated that we would save $500 million. And that, in the bill, they stipulate that that savings will be used to make sentencing or recidivism reduction programs. That is how we can solve this problem with mass incarceration. We can reduce the amount of time they spend in prison, and we can help them with these programs to ensure that they are less likely to go back to prison.